Panel, Lebanon is in a state of immense confusion. There are large-scale political faction groups that all continuously disagree on the way the country is run. As a result, the country is being run into the ground. They're in an energy crisis where you literally cannot keep the lights on for more than an hour at a time. They're in a food crisis. They're in several, literally cannot get worse for this country. In addition to this, we think in these large-scale factions, these are heavily religious groups that prop their own data about the way they think government should be run. They falsify records, they falsify data, and they use this to convince governments and convince people to vote for them and pass policy in a way that we think is actually very disingenuous and very detrimental to the country as a whole. We think that the current way the Lebanese government is run is literally based on a census that was run in the aftermath of French colonization in 1932. It has been literally over 90 years since then. It does not reflect the Lebanon of today. We are the only side that gives Lebanon clarity and potentially a chance of fair representation. 3 things in this speech. First, on setup. Second, on why this is likely to be done well. Third, on why information is good for governance. Or actually, fourth as well, on political action. Okay, firstly on setup. I already told you Lebanon is in an immense crisis, right? It is divided, but note that it is also difficult for Lebanon to form government. That is, the seats exist in a perfect 50-50 split, i.e. we think that there are substantial union voting blocks on policy, which means that policy is particularly inefficient, i.e. in order to pass any significant policy, these huge blocks need to sort of have someone like cross the floor, essentially. But given that these blocks are made up of oppositional religious groups that are in direct disagreement with one another, particularly for the fact that we think these groups feel like they are being under or overrepresented, we think that this is the reason why Lebanese policy is so inefficient and is so dysfunctional. So we think that as a result, largely, Lebanon is unable to enforce a number of their government restrictions. I.e., they have very large taxation problems at the moment. People just refuse to pay tax because they do not buy into what the government is telling them. Also, there is huge government supply problems. I already told you about electricity. This is largely true. This is OIV knowledge. Okay. Finally, we think that our burden in this debate is very low. We do not have to defend a world in which this entire political system is overhauled. All we have to defend is literally the benefits for the census. This debate is not about whether Lebanon should completely overhaul the confessional system, although teams are able to make arguments on that. That is not our burden in this debate. And we think this debate therefore requires relatively low fiat from either team in order to pass this survey. Firstly, why we think this census is to be done well. What do we think that we included in this census? I think there'll be things about people's religious affiliations, people's personal and household incomes, about geographic location, about the number of members of each family, things that you would hope to include in a regular census. Who do we think that this survey would be conducted by? Well, we think it would probably be conducted by the Lebanese government in conjunction with pre-existing aid agencies in Lebanon, i.e. the UN, or whatever. We think that this could be done pretty simply. You could either just set up polling booths in each area in which these foreign aid organizations would just protect the way that these votes are being done, or you could just potentially do it online in the event that the Lebanese government does discharge a significant amount of the remaining electricity supply to keep the online voting from whatever. But we think that this would be largely held in public areas, and we think that it's just an incentive for these groups to do this well. Also, other world governments do want to see the instability in this country reduced, particularly it is in a particularly high politically tensioned area in the Middle East. We do not want this country being susceptible to things like being invaded and terrorism, whatever. Okay. Secondly, why we think information is good for governments. The first is just the governments are able to make better allocation of resources. When your country is in the literal worst economic crisis it has seen for hundreds of years, the importance and accuracy of your information is the point at which you need to allocate your resources properly. That is the reason why Lebanon is in such a crisis at the moment. And we tell you that you literally could not get less reflective information about the way that Lebanon is than a census from 1932, right? This is over 90 years ago. Lebanon has changed drastically since then. Lebanon has experienced vast swathes of migration and huge economic reforms within this time. We think that this would be far more reflective of now knowing where people geographically live. We now know where services are lacking in terms of supply and in terms of money being inputted. As a result, we think you just get a few extra benefits. Even if this census isn't perfect, it's going to be better than the 1932 census. You get things like probably greater access to religious services, greater access to public health or energy supply in the areas they need to, because they're not being directed based on information from 1932 or information provided by incentivized religious groups to skew information in their favor. Secondly, we think that just making this information public is also very good. We're talking about the general trends in this information, not people's personal information, obviously. We think just giving this to aid agencies, giving this to foreign investors is particularly good because they can invest their money in more confident ways, i.e. they're not wasting these resources. The third thing is just We allow religious groups, when religious groups target their electoral campaigns based on the previously falsified data, that like does not occur, or does not occur to the same extent under our side of the house. So we think that just like they're now able to target their information more accurately. And fourthly, private companies within Lebanon are able to find the best places to invest and like use the domestic economy. Okay, great. What do we think the impacts of these arguments are? First, it's just like governments have drastically better resource allocation, which is particularly important when you're in a massive fucking economic crisis. People literally cannot keep the lights on, afford to put food on the table. People cannot afford to go to public health. It literally does not exist. We would just note that, like, yes, the Lebanese government, it is imperfect at like a central government level. But they also do just have like state and local governments that could use this information in particularly meaningful ways and just actually spend the money within their local areas and use this census data particularly well, or to a degree, much better than information from the 1932 census. Okay, we think also at the point in which there is a new government, they would have access to this info as well. So this is also just like has its particularly long-term benefits. They set a precedent of conducting, I don't know, censuses that are more common than every 90 years, where the information would get updated to a degree of being particularly good. Okay, finally, we think that just like people are constantly mired by incorrect data in the status quo, right? And this is a way for the Lebanese government or Lebanese political factions to show legitimacy, right? It means that religious groups can no longer skew this information. It means that aid groups that actually care about representing this information objectively do so, and people buy into the legitimacy of these aid groups because they're already on the ground helping Lebanese citizens deal with this economic crisis. They are the people they trust, not their failing government and status quo, not these religious factions that would just be running on populist rhetoric. We think this is way better on our side of the house. We think the impact of this is also, you just like get people to vote in better ways, right? Just like get people to vote for the more representative parties. Even if the political system as a whole doesn't overhaul, you just get people to vote in particularly more representative ways. Okay, finally I'm going to move on to political action. Okay, yeah, I already told you that it's like not our burden to prove that you substantially change and overhaul the makeup of this political system. But we think that in the event that you do, this census allows you to enable, allows Lebanese citizens to pressure the government in a particularly meaningful and accurate way to change the makeup of the government. Why can they not do this previously? It's just because that the parties that are disproportionately overrepresented, i.e. the Maronite Catholics, have a direct incentive to push data that displays that they are not overrepresented to remain in control, right? So we think that that doesn't occur under our side of the house to the same degree that occurs on the side negative. We also just think like you increase the number of people voting, and you increase the accuracy of their votes. And the final thing is just like this is in the interest of like the confessional government to change to some degree, to reduce deadlocks, right? Because at a time where you are in an economic crisis, you want to be passing policy that is particularly representative, is particularly not wasting money, is particularly going to make you re-electable, i.e. you can only do this with the information that's provided under our side of the house, doing it with this census. So, what do you have to believe at the end of this argument? You also have to believe that with accurate data, that comes an accuracy of representation. And that's a huge principal benefit for the currently underrepresented members of Lebanon. And we think that even if you don't significantly overhaul the system to a degree, our side is the only one that enables them to get them out of this economic crisis. That's why I'm so proud of them.
Confusion is a funny word used by this affirmative team. In a country where Israel is bombing their south, to the point where people cannot function anymore, to the point where a president resigned over a year ago and that position has still not been filled. When my Maronite Catholic grandparents fled the country in fear of persecution, they were not confused. They left a country I am not afraid to say is practically a failed state. The only world where a census is held in Lebanon is one filled with riots, filled with tension and violence, all for the corrupt government never to use that information in the first place. This affirmative team hedges their case on resource allocation. What resource allocation? The ones they left in a back to the Lebanese civil war. Firstly, on a point of context, what is the current political context in Lebanon? There is so much chaos, firstly, that when the president resigned, as I flagged in my introduction, due to accusations of corruption, there has been no one filling this place for years. This is not because of anything religious, it is because no one wants to run a country where it seems impossible to get anything done. Secondly, Parliament often descends into chaos. Thirdly, if it even runs at all, there is no president. There are vacancies in the local and state governments that the affirmative team talks about. Thirdly, they are in a state of war, engaging with Israel, where their population is being bombed. Fourthly, corruption is rampant, and it has been since before 1932. I've tried to tell you about resources. These are the ones that the politicians keep for themselves anyway. At the end of this point, the political climate is already chaotic for non-religious reasons. Secondly, what is the economic context? We probably agree that Lebanon has major hyperinflation, and notably banks have frozen the population's assets for years. This has led to people being economically desperate in circumstances in ways we know make people more hatred towards the other, makes them desperate for someone to blame. And the third question is, what is the social and religious context in Lebanon? Obviously, due to both surveys and people's lived experiences, they know the numbers have changed since 1932. A major change is probably obvious when you were living in the country. Yet, the overwhelming majority of politicians and people don't think that we should hold a census. So you ask yourself in this debate, who is pushing for this? In the circumstances where Lebanon can barely feed its people, why are you pushing for a census? All ACT needs to prove why this needs to happen now and why it needs to happen in this way. Affirmative has no imperative. Let's talk on why this would not result in a transition of power. The reason I ask this question is because it seems to be the most proximate imperative for doing this, where affirmative does not have the resources to allocate in the first place. The first question is, why is Parliament unlikely to change? As I pointed out earlier, corruption within the government is rampant. If it does not benefit you to change the makeup of Parliament, you are likely to cast doubt on the conduction of the census in the first place. Secondly, it is unclear this census would not be fucked in the first place, given there are interests on both sides. And thirdly, corrupt people often don't believe in giving up their own power. So the second mechanism here is that Maronite Catholics, who probably stand the most to lose in this debate because they are likely to be in the minority, would not want to give up that power. 3 reasons. Firstly, they are scared to find out, to have a confirmation that they are in the minority. The context here is that both my grandparents are one of 14 because their parents feared so deeply of being in the minority to Sunni Muslims in Lebanon. Secondly, people don't like giving up power because of, thirdly, the status quo bias where it has been 50-50 for a really long time. It is scary to see your parliament and its makeup change in a way that seems like it will take away a lot of your power, especially when it's been that way forever. So the impact here then is whether we should ask the question of whether perfect representation is even a good thing, even if Maronite Catholics are 30% and are in the minority. That is still a sizable minority that you should care about because it prevents the tyranny of the majority, and it probably means 50-50 is fine. It is not that far off anyway. Secondly, the census also isn't good for anything else besides politics. There's very little a census can do that a survey cannot. This looks like health surveys, but it does come with a political context uniquely that surveys do not have. Why does this cause an enormous sectarian conflict? Note this argument is not contingent on political transfer of power. This is talking about the second that a census is announced, the panic and the riots that it causes. The first question is, why are people so afraid of the census? The first here is not so long ago Civil War memories. The Lebanese population is a particularly traumatized one. It's been filled with violence and hatred for decades and decades. They do not like any form of any more political or religious tension. Secondly, there is already an extremely entrenched religious divide. This looks like where Maronite Catholics and Sunni Muslims are likely to live. They live in completely different regions often. This tension not only is overt, but often bubbles under the surface. And thirdly, people have so much distrust in the government, even if the neglectful and corrupt government tried to assure them that things would be fine, that there would be no riots, they wouldn't listen. The second question is, how do people respond when the census is announced? Firstly, panic, especially regarding Maronite Catholics, who are likely to be in the minority, who feel like they could be targeted violently in their own homes, in their own country. Secondly, when it is being conducted with the very boost that the affirmative talks about, why is it unlikely that violence is not likely to erupt around these centres, where people feel like the power is about to be ripped from them as one more person walks into that booth, they perceive them to be one more person taking away their power and liberty in that country. Thirdly, people are likely to flee the country. This is already happening en masse now. I think this probably exacerbates that issue. Fourthly, it is likely that those with power in the majority can take it upon themselves to respond with violence, because it is no secret that Maronite Catholics who have been in the 50-50 have taken away power from Muslims, where there is entrenched religious divide, where Muslims are likely to feel they have been treated terribly by a government that does not represent their population. It is unclear why they do not want to respond with violence back. Fifthly, Israel is probably going to continue making more and more moves, as it already is on southern Lebanon, noting a moment of weakness for Hezbollah. And what are the obvious impacts here? People die, people lose any remaining faith they had in a government that's failed them time and time again. Businesses cannot operate. Any investors in the country, if there even are any now, pull out because of the violence and uncertainty. Fifthly, when I talk about targeting Maronite Catholics, a census that reveals their exact location where they are likely to live is where my family would be targeted, where they are likely to be killed en masse, because that is the only way that people that hate them are able to access their exact location in the first place. So proud to negate.
Government census, there is only one other set of circumstances in which people in these contexts get asked what religious group they are from, and that context is an incredibly scary one. And this team pretends, and they lie, and they say that when someone who works for the government or someone who works for an institution that is not from your country comes to you and says, where do you live, what is your occupation, are you Muslim or are you Catholic, that they will react with anything but utter dread. Utter fear at what happened to their country before their eyes. Utter fear at what happened to their families when they were ethnically cleansed and had to flee the country. Utter fear at what this government might do to them, or what their neighbours and their co-workers might do to them if this conflict is reignited. This team sit on a throne of lies because they tell you that the reason that Lebanon's government is not perceived to be legitimate is because it is 50% Maronite Catholic and 50% Muslim. It's not viewed to be legitimate because it does not function. And they have not yet proven why the overwhelming reason for that non-function is this religious division. They cannot win this debate. Let's firstly explain whether this will fix Lebanon's government. Then I will explain the actual win condition of this debate, which is sectarian conflict. Because to be honest, the situation in Lebanon is pretty dire, but I think that ethnic cleansing and the genocide of a religious group is more dire than that. So unless this team can prove that it is so dysfunctional and so awful and so irreformable that it is worth risking a genocide, that it is worth risking a reignition of a civil conflict that has claimed thousands of lives, they absolutely lose. Let's talk about whether this will fix Lebanon's government. And I would just make one note at the start of this point. Lebanese politicians do not agree on very much, as I think this affirmative team identifies, but they universally agree that holding another census would be a bad idea. That is perhaps one of the few things that they universally agree on. So you really have to question why that is. When it is the case that there was a census almost a century ago, question why that is. The first claim that this team makes is that, well, the reason that the Lebanese government functions so poorly is because there are these huge blocks, and that requires people to cross the floor, which they are unwilling to do because of their religion, which leads to bad policy and chaos. The first question I'd ask is, what are these differences? Like, what are these policy differences that are split exclusively along religious lines? Because they actually don't point to a single one of them. They just say there are differences and they are unwilling to cooperate for that reason, as opposed to like any other set of government policies, which are overwhelmingly kind of boring, involve things like supply and confidence. The second thing I'd say is just ask whether there are any other reasons why Lebanon's government might function in a bad way. Is it because perhaps it is a post-colonial state? Is it perhaps because of the chaos caused by international meddling in the Middle East that has moved refugees into their border, that has caused them to be bombed along their southern border by Israel, that has resulted in enormous conflict for them to deal with? Is it because of corruption that has failed to be stamped out? Is it because of a civil war that really wasn't that long ago and cut off the Lebanese population and destroyed their business infrastructure, destroyed their transport? Or is it hyperinflation pressures due to COVID and poor monetary policy that has nothing to do with it because they're not a religious quota of the central bank of Lebanon? So, at the end of that, I believe that there are really plausible reasons why Lebanon's government behaves and functions in ways that are bad, that are not really fixable by calling for a census. The second thing that they say, well, these problems are due to illegitimacy and non-participation in the government, which is based on this distribution of representation. One, they absolutely do not prove this. Like, they do not prove that just because your government isn't perfectly representative, that this actually meaningfully is the thing that reduces your participation in that government. The second thing I'd say here is more damning for this team, which is this restoration of legitimacy is wholly contingent on proving that this transition happens and happens well, which they also do not prove. And we explain at live enormously to very little response that this in fact will not happen in a good way. It will happen and people will die. Aid workers will die as they staff those census booths. People will meddle in the census and will do all sorts of awful things. Thirdly, it is honestly better to have people mad at a dysfunctional government than mad at each other. And when you turn them against each other, when you conduct that census, you make them mad at the other. You make Sunni Muslims mad at Maronite Catholics because you say, well, they are a numerical minority, they're dominating our government, and they are the problem. You make Maronite Catholics believe that the Sunnis are trying to wipe them out. If it is better to blame a dysfunctional government, we'd rather that. The third thing they say is that, well, the reason that you have terrorism is because people don't have a legitimate way to speak out. I am unclear why that changes. An enormous amount of this terrorism is derived from other failed states, it's derived from the movement of people, and we explain at length, in fact, all the mechanisms that you require to believe that this will lead to an increase in terrorism, this will lead to an increase in vigilante violence, all of that. Their last claim is that, well, people don't have resources on the ground and they're therefore mad because of this, so if we restore legitimacy in the government and our ability to conduct supply, that will be better. Two things. One, unclear that you actually fix supply. Like, they have not provided us any sort of policies that the Lebanese government will meaningfully restore supplies to these people. And secondly, these religious institutions are also pretty robust. Like, there are aid networks that operate within these countries. There are international sources of aid that all operate to make sure that these people's basic needs are met at least a little bit. This will not fix the government. That is their path to victory dead in the water. Not ours. We explain that this leads to an enormous increase in the likelihood of sectarian violence. We explain that people will die. We explain that people will lose their homes, their businesses, that people will lose faith in Lebanon. They will see it for a failed state. They will see it for worse than a failed state. What are their claims here? They have one. They say it can be done well. It can be done well? Are you fucking kidding me? Firstly, the best case of it being done well is to put more guns around the census locations. What? The only case of securing these passes for people would increase the likelihood quite dramatically that somebody gets shot, or that somebody gets trampled, or that somebody gets herded into a place where they're then crushed. They secondly just implicate the United Nations, the extent that they say there are NGOs who are capable of doing this well. You breed a whole lot of distrust in those precise institutions. Say you participated in a census that you believe to be illegitimate, because you perceive that census to be trying to meddle. Either you are Sunni and you believe that the census is trying to bolster the amount of Maronite Catholics, or you're a Maronite Catholic, you believe that the census is trying to prove that you're a minority and therefore able to be oppressed. What happens when you conduct the census? We step it through chronologically. What happens before the census? The census is announced, people panic immediately, especially Maronite Catholics. Those who can flee, do. Those who can want supplies, do. Those who can arm themselves, do. Because they see it as an exact repeat of what happened 30 years ago when they and their family were on the line and at the end of a gun. The memories of the war are incredibly fresh in these people's memories. They are very long. Those wounds are putrid if you reopen them. Again, secondly, people preemptively strike out at the others, either to shore up a result that goes their way, or out of fear of what the other will do to you when that result comes out, the fear that you will be wiped out, the fear that you will be dominated. And secondly, during the census, one, the flames are stoked by those who would see Lebanon fall. I could leave because they do not think that this country is capable of ensuring any stability at all. They do not believe that it is capable of fixing itself. Ethnic cleansing happens on the streets, people die, people engage in terrorism, and people have an extraordinary distrust in the government. Because the one thing that was holding this government together was that they would rather than set a census, like, you know, a representational level at a census that was conducted immediately after the Civil War, try to at least pretend that that Civil War didn't happen, try to at least pretend that loads of people didn't die, and set it at what people wanted Lebanon to be, what they thought Lebanon was at the moment that it was made independent. That was the Lebanon that they could maybe believe in. This is not how you get people to trust the government. This is not how you fix it. This is absolutely a side negative win.
Thank you so much for the affirmative. Finish the debate. We've got the negative.
The threat of inexactness the side affirmative frames as the harm in this debate is the benefit that shields minorities from systematic and exact persecution. Because when you know where every minority lives, when you know the areas that you are the majority in, that is when you can divert funding more aggressively. That is when you can bomb houses and burn places of worship, because you know for a fact that that is where those people reside. The inaccuracies and the kind of softness of information is what is protecting these people. Side affirmative will remove that final shield, damning them to persecution, damning them to bloodshed. That's why negative wins the debate. Two things in this speech. First of all, crushing their win on political change. Firstly, an intuition pump here that I think pumps this out of the debate instantly. Everyone from First agrees that the government of Lebanon is currently dysfunctional. We identify that there are slots in parliament that simply have not been filled. We identify the fact that there is corruption and an inability to provide resources. We all also agree that there is currently bombing on the border of Lebanon, that there is currently a crisis in access to resources. So the best case of this side affirmative is that a government that is dysfunctional now has information to allocate resources that don't exist to people who clearly would be allocated to who it would be allocated poorly. So best case that they have is you get more information for an apparatus that doesn't work to dedicate resources that don't exist. Line by line though, explaining why that claim doesn't work. Firstly, they try to explain that this deletes political deadlock, which has prevented any level of political change. First, I'm unclear that the level of political deadlock that they identify is one of economics, is one of electricity, and is one of food. Because the kinds of deadlocks that exist between religious groups is on religion, how much spending you do on your religion, how much kind of protection you have for that religion. So if there is a deadlock, it is probably just getting equal access and equal protection of religion. And if there is a deadlock and there is so much stubbornness, it indicates to you when there is a shift in the makeup of this parliament, you just get mega persecution of the very large minority, that is the 30% of Christians, which is incredibly bad. But second of all, we explained to you that the economic and electricity deadlocks are obviously mutually beneficial to fix. Like, I'm unclear why there would be disagreement there about whether or not Lebanon needs food or electricity or safety. Like, this is shit people agree on and they pass this policy well. This kind of change doesn't actually get that benefit here. But third of all, even if they try to claim that they aren't actually trying to get political reform in the makeup of the parliament, I don't think that they can fiat that in. Because when these numbers are published, people will demand change. Because the previous census and the previous makeup was based on that 1934 census. So the second you have another census, the expectation is to change and adjust based on that system, which is why you get this inequitable distribution. That then explains to you that it is unclear that this is the kind of deadlock that exists, and that is the reason that it could beat it. The second claim they give you is that this gives you more access to information and the ability to do more policy. First, we identified it first and then again at second that there are other ways of identifying things that people need and where they need it. You can just ask them what the output of their area is. You can identify the levels of poverty. The difference in this debate is a full census versus a series of surveys. And the crucial difference there is the exactness and the preciseness that affirmative needs to defend. You need to know the race and the religion, where they live, how much they earn, and where they go. Because that is what a census is. We can just take all of the beneficial information we need through censuses. I'm so unclear what the delta that they hope to get is. But second of all, it is just unlikely that this census is particularly good, that it will still be treated as such. Because one, we explained to you there are a series of incentives to publicly boycott this census. People are afraid to vote because they might get shot when they put down their religion. People are going to repress others from expressing their religion and expressing their views in order to protect their place in parliament. It is likely to be boycotted by international actors who know that this is the moment to cause instability in Lebanon. I do not know why they get this perfect representation, but people will still act as if it is, because the political system itself is based upon that census from 1934. So it isn't actually a good census, but people treat it as such. But finally, it's explained in the introduction and explained in the way off, you simply cannot act on that information, even if that information exists. Lebanon literally does not have a president right now. How the fuck are you going to allocate all of your resources? You obviously cannot. And they try to address it like, the vague arc of history. I mean, eventually we can do something with this information. But why? Because when the country is drowning in blood of attacked minorities, when the country is drowning in bombs shattered from Israel, I do not know why this is going to get better at any point into the short or long term. You cannot get this information, and people cannot act on this information because it is incredibly bad. But finally, taking them at their best, you get this information, that information is accurate, and you have resources to allocate. I don't know why it's allocated equitably, because now the majority government, which is made up of Muslim people, can just direct the funds to people who agree with their religion and agree with their race. Because what this means is that there is a finite quantity of resources. Obviously, you support people of your own creed and of your own religion. So the areas that are majority Christian are deprived of electricity, are deprived of food, are deprived of water. But the world we support is one of hedging, because you know your people could be anywhere, so you support everyone. That is the equity we get on side negative, and that is what they deprive people of on side negative. Notice, that is their best case, an inequitable and an aggressive system of oppression. That is their win point. You cannot give them this debate. Their final push here is that maybe this is done by the UN, and this means people are going to like it, they agree with it, but they have this tension when they say they're going to employ a bunch of people from Lebanon to do it. So obviously that level of bias still exists. You cannot give them this impartial active point. What this means is that you don't get political change, and even if you get that information, you can't act on it properly. All of this leads to political disenfranchisement, which does beget terror. Their final dying breath on this issue is saying this creates government legitimacy. But seriously, the last census was from 1934. Do you believe the reason there hasn't been filled seats in Parliament for the last, do you seriously believe that for the last 9 years there has not been an iota of faith in the government? Obviously, it clearly isn't, because people aren't crying out for the census, and thus you don't need it. The reason there isn't government legitimacy is entirely exogenous. We explained this to you at Liv and then at Connor. We probably exacerbate distrust in the government on side affirmative, because they ask you your race, they ask you your religion, and you know that's been used against you. You know that's why your communities were purged in the past. So you were deeply suspicious of this system. Their wing-con of reform falls shut. Why do we crush them in this debate? It is on violence. Our first harm here is that you literally dox everyone. Like, you give their name, you give their address, you give their religion to the government. They say, no, you can be unspecific with it. But then what is the census doing? Like, you need to fill in your name, you've got to fill in where you live, you've got to fill in your religion. Then all of that data is collected and published for everyone to access, so they can get any of the benefits of business investment or whatever. This means your average punter can just look up, I wonder where the Christians in my area are, and then maybe do a hate crime if you feel like it. Like, that is the harm we're talking about. Especially, it's not just like if you feel like it, by the way. Like, there's a series of incentives that people want to do violence, because they feel like perhaps the future of Lebanon is in their hands, because the government could be changing in the next few moments. They do want to control the fact that they are strong, but even if they are the minority, they feel like they're going to lose political representation, because when the threat of a rearranging of parliament looms overhead, you go towards terror, because you don't think you're going to get a vote in the future, and the only way you can entrench your power is through firearms and is through fire. That is why you get violence, regardless what kind of person you are. And then second of all, we explain to you why the process of the census itself, regardless of the information it publishes, is going to be violent. We explain to you international actors are going to boycott this and attack. We explain to you guards are going to be around polling stations that will shoot people, and we explain to you that there will be indiscriminate attacks. Their claims here are paper thin. They say that data stops misinformation, but misinformation is what protects people because there is plausible deniability about who might live in your area, that you don't have the confidence to act on that information. At the end of this debate, you should be deeply uncertain whether it is possible for the crippled government of Lebanon to do anything beneficial, but you should be damn sure that anyone who cares can kill anyone else they want. That's why negative wins.